good to see you here this evening. I hope you had a good afternoon. I just walked through a major rainstorm from the other building to get here. Not actually, it was sprinkling in case you're wondering. But it is good to see you, and I hope that you are ready to study God's Word together. If you'd like to have an outline of the lesson, you just give raise your hand, and that man in the back will be happy to give you one. The Apostle Paul admonished young Timothy in 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter, in verse 12, to be an example of the believers. In the book of Proverbs, the 16th chapter, in verse 31, we find that the hoary head, that's us gray-headed folk, is a crown of glory, if it be found in the way of righteousness. That tells us that, no matter what we look at, we realize, as we said this morning, there's one thing that's going to happen to all of us, and that is we're going to leave this life. The Lord tells us through Peter in 2 Peter 3 that this world is going to end. And we ought to live in such a way that we're going to be found pure and without spot. That's what James describes pure Christianity as in James 1 and verse 27. So you look at that and you realize that doing that, living that life that is right and proper, that is found in the way of righteousness, it's exemplary, it's not easy, is it? There are a lot of things that come against us in life, a lot of discouragement, a lot of trials. And you think about it where sometimes it's easy to get a bit discouraged. You look and you think, all the things happen to me, what does it matter anyway? Why do I keep on trying? I ought to just give up. Well, the reality is the devil would like to have us do that very thing. Well, we know that God has given us the ability to have that overcoming attitude instead of overcome. And we realize that as we go through life, we see that there is not only the admonition in the Scriptures to live this way, and God acknowledging that He's going to give us a way of escape, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, no matter what comes on us, we can bear it. But one of the great things we have is examples. You look and you find in Romans 15:4, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11, that the old covenant is given to us, that we can have these examples, that we can have hope, and that we can also look and have this ability that I don't want to do this. But inherent in that is there are those we want to see that we do follow them. And you think about the discouragements that come. I don't know any of us, maybe you're different, but I doubt it, who hasn't just at times been overcome with discouragement and despair, just worn out, and wonder, why go on? Does anybody really care? Nobody understands. My wife calls it a pity party, and if I start having one, she tells me to snap out of it. But the reality is it's something that comes upon us. But one of the good things is number one, the acknowledgement that God is always there. He'll never leave us nor forsake us. He is always there to provide that way of escape, to give us all things that pertain to life and godliness, to give us all of the needs we have through Christ Jesus, Philippians 4 and verse 19. But you look and you realize that there are examples in the Bible. Whenever I get to thinking, well, nobody knows, you just don't understand what I'm going through, then I look and I see what individuals have faced and how, in spite of that, they were overcomers. One of them that I think is familiar to all of us is a young man named Joseph. And you think about him and how you look back in the book of Genesis in chapter 37 and down through chapter 39, you find the things that came upon him. And if you look back, you think about the struggles that this young man went through. In chapter 37 of Genesis, we find that his brothers and even his father, he had these dreams of the sheaf. It says in verse 5 of chapter 37, he dreamed a dream. He told his brethren, they hated him yet the more. You look at that and he talks about the binding of the sheaves and such and how it was that they bowed down. And then the sun, moon, and the stars, and there his father even looked at him, am I going to do that? But you look and you think here he got something, he received some kind of a dream, and whenever he recounted to them, instead of seeking to understand or anything else, he was mocked by his own family, even his father. But then you go on to chapter 37, verse 18 through 28, that envy, says in the end of the second dream that his brothers envied him. His father put it in his mind. He thought about these things. But the brothers were envious of him. And we find in verse 18 through 28 that they took him out and he was with them and he said, we're going to kill him. Well, thankfully Reuben was an interceder and they convinced him, no, we're not going to kill him, but we're going to sell him. They put him in a pit without water, but then they determined to sell him. But there he was in that pit all alone. He had been mocked, and now no doubt he heard, we're going to kill him. No, we're going to do better. We're going to sell him. But there all alone, deserted, completely rejected. And then in chapter 37 and verse 36, we find that these came by and he was sold and eventually sold to Potiphar. So now here he is in a strange place, away from the family, which some might think, well, that's good, depending on the way he treated them. But you know, even whenever you're treated bad by some people at your family, you still long for that fellowship. You still long to have a family member, which we'd see later in Joseph's life. But you look and you think, here he is, he's sold in a strange place. But there, if you go over to chapter 39, you find that even in this setting, he began to prosper. You think, well, okay, everything's going to be okay now, because in chapter 39, as he was there, brought down into Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, that he found grace in his sight, and he was risen to a place of prominence. Potiphar entrusted him with so many things. In verse 9, it says, there's none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me. That is said as he's facing another trial. But it gives a situation in which he lived. Here he is. He's overcome all of these things. Things are finally going okay in my life. Things are going to be okay. And now, in this position, Potiphar's wife. Now remember here, this is a young man. Whenever he was taken by his brothers, he was 17 years old. And so I'm not sure how long it transpired, but I'd assume not a very long time. But he is there, and Potiphar's wife tempts him. Come lie with me. He refused. Come lie with me. And this time she took and she grabbed him by his coat. He was fleeing. She grabbed his coat. He left it behind. And he ran. But now this woman, so devious, she said, he tried to take advantage of me. I screamed. So now this is told unto Potiphar, who had seen him, who had watched him and entrusted him so much. And he tells him, you're going to be placed in prison. And so you find he's falsely accused. He's cast into prison. That's horrible. Now we know eventually in prison there were events that came about where he was again brought to a place of preeminence and he grew and prospered. But there in prison, you see him as a man who had overcome. He was there, he was in a bad situation. But he had overcome all of those things that his family tossed against him. He had overcome the temptations, overcome the lies. He was suffering unjustly, but he himself was right with himself and right with God. And in all of those things, he had so much that he overcome. You think about the things that worked against him. His age. He wasn't like these older men, these learned individuals. What about the treatment from others? I mean, if anybody could say, nobody cares about me, it would have been Joseph. His own family, his brothers. We're going to cast you into a pit. We're going to kill you. No, we're going to sell you instead. I mean, all of these things were there. What about the examples that surrounded him? I mean, I think the situation in his family was described as Paul would speak of Timothy, and whenever he extolled the virtues of Timothy, and he says, I have no man like-minded who will naturally look upon the things of others. Every man looks upon his own. I mean, that's it. That's the society in which sadly we oftentimes find ourselves, but it's where Joseph was. Nobody was looking out for Joseph. Everybody was looking out for their own, but it seems Joseph had a different mindset. What about the lust, the temptation? Obviously, Joseph, like any, could be tempted. James tells us that every man is tempted when he's drawn away and after his own lust. But only the problem comes of sin whenever you let that conceive. Joseph was a young man who would have naturally been tempted maybe, but you look and he overcame that. And in the sorrow, mistreated, my family, I think I finally found a friend in Potiphar. He's entrusted me. But now cast into prison by that very one. All of that would bring one of the greatest tools the devil has, discouragement. The devil would love to have us discouraged. He gets us in the moment of being down, discouraged, and he can make things look so very good. Nobody cares. Why not? If you don't believe that, look in the world around us. What do you see? You know, through the years I've been a Christian, and even before that, talking to people who face the trials, the struggles, the hardships of the world, and you see them, they get down. And what do? With the thought that nobody cares, it doesn't matter, they engage in all sorts of things. Sin. I mean, that's the broad word. God's given us a life to live, remember, 1 Timothy 4, be that example. Proverbs 16, have you in old age be found in righteousness? But I'm tired of that. Doesn't matter. And so the discouragement, I look, and those things that the world has to offer become so attractive. Sin lies at the door, and we open it. We look and we involve ourselves in just every type of unrestrained living. So many times it's done to the auspices of being hidden, but we know God sees all. But actually the world sees a lot. But we get to the point where we don't care. You look at the way people act, the things they engage in. You know, you think about the illicit sexual activity. That's one of the common avenues. I don't care. I'm going to go and I'm going to fulfill that lust. You think about the appeal of various drugs. It can be cigarettes, it can be alcohol, it can be any other of the street drugs and such. And how many people turn to them, a way of escape? I've talked to people through the years that look and they've been asked, why you do that? To escape. I mean, it can even be as simple, why do you drink? Had a hard day. Got to have something to relieve my tension. Those very same people say, well, alcohol doesn't affect me. Well, how does it relieve your tension? Because it hardens you. It dulls your senses. And it makes you escape. And that's what makes it so appealing to people. Other drugs, the same way. I've talked to people who have been involved in various drugs. And they say, well, I take that. I inject it. Swallow it, I snort it, whatever it is, and it's just just a release. But the problems are still there. The ungodly things are still there. My bad choices are still there. And sadly, whenever people realize that, suicide. You ever known anybody committed suicide? I have. I've talked to people that have said, I don't see any way out. I don't see any reason to live. I'm going to end it all. Joseph faced all of those things, and he chose not to go down that avenue, though. You think about that, and you think, why? What is it that set him apart? I want to know that because I want to be set apart. Because the things that happened to him, remember 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13? God's going to provide a way of escape. A way of escape from what? The things that come upon us are common to all men. You see, Joseph, you look at him, you think, oh man, I don't know how they could do that. Chances are you've done it in your life. That you've faced many of those things, many of those struggles, many of those trials, many of those discouragements. May not be in the same way, but they still come upon every single one of us in various fashions. Thankfully, we're not all going through all of those trials, but I know many people who have faced just about every one of those. And you think about, I need to know what he did to remain pure. To be that example that we can look back and read about him not as one who has overcome with sin and destroyed his life because of it, but one who stood steadfast. And it's really not an elaborate type of formula. You go back to the book of Genesis in chapter 39, and you look at that in verse 7. It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. He refused, said to his master's wife, behold, my master knoweth not what it is with me in the house, and he hath committed all things he hath unto my hand. There's none greater in this house than me. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Well, of course, whenever he wouldn't hearken to her, well, she took him, she grabbed his coat, tried to force him. But you look at that and you find in that simple statement the answer that each of us needs. Each of us, we face the things that are common to all men. It may not be in the same flavor, so to speak, may not be in the same cover, but these things that Joseph faced are the things that you and I face to various degrees. And so what his response was that he has not kept back anything from me because thou art his wife. He was concerned about his master. He was concerned about this one who had trusted him. He cared for him. He didn't want to do wrong against him. But then he looked and he said, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin? He looked at himself and he said, I'm better than this. I am not that type of person. That is wicked. That is sin. So many times we try to soften the blow. Everybody else is doing it. How many people do you know that in that same circumstance would not have looked around and said, oh, let's close the door and I'll lie with you? I'm sure that there were many people there who would have done it. But he looked at the world round about in a different view. It wasn't him. What she is proposing is wickedness. It is sin. He looked at himself and he said, I have a higher standard for me. Remember what I said about Timothy? Be that example of the believer. He knew he was. Didn't matter if he didn't see who was watching. He didn't know that centuries later you and I'd be watching. But he knew who he was, who he should be. You know, I can remember through my life, you know, my dad, he would find me doing stuff, and he'd say, son, you're better than that. I look and I hope through the years that I've instilled in my family, you're better than that. You go out, you make somebody's life better. You can make a difference in somebody's life, a difference for good. I mean, that's who we ought to think of ourselves as. Sin lies at the door. I don't have to open it. I can say no, but I make that commitment beforehand based upon my concern for self. I'm not that type of person. Matter of fact, I hope that all of us would be insulted if somebody even offered this, that they would think that I was that type of person. I can imagine Joseph looking and say, where'd you get the idea that I would even do that? How could you comprehend that I would even think about that? And I hope that's the life we live because we know who we are. But then it goes a step further. Not only who we are, but he says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? That's whose I am. You see, I know the impact I can have on others. I know the power of influence. You do too. But I also know who I am and the ability I have to remain pure. I can make that choice. But the only way that I'm going to make it sure and steadfast is if it does matter. You see, if in this life only you have hope, the writer in 1 Corinthians 15, in arguing for the fact of the resurrection, he said, in this life only you have hope in Christ Jesus, you have all been most miserable, most pitiable. I mean, if this is all there is, who cares? But whenever I have this concern for others around me, and I have this concern and knowledge of myself, who I am, and all of that because of whose I am, I'm an amazing individual. I am not going to allow myself to be overtaken by sin. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to be the one who looks and says, it doesn't matter, who cares? I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to say no to whatever it is this world puts before me, and the world's going to put it there. Every single one of us. I don't care whether you're young, I don't care whether you're old. The temptations are brought before you. The devil will look and he'll find that little chink in your armor and he'll start putting things there. And we make the decision, I'm not going to do that to others. That's not who I am. I'm not going to do it to myself because I am God's. And whenever I have that instilled in me, I am more than a conqueror through him that loved me. You go over to Romans the 8th chapter, and it's amazing what you find there. The blessedness of who we are. You know, in that chapter, he says that you and I, if we're children of God, we are heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. Can you imagine that? I mean, it's like, here's the reading of the will. And here's all the blessings that are found from God. And you think, well, here it is. Here's his only begotten Son. And he says, Jack, you're an heir of mine. You're a joint heir with Christ. And so I look and I see that in all these things I am more than conquerors. I know then, because of who I am, whose I am, my concern for others, that all things will work together for good because I love God and I'm called according to his purpose. In all these things I am more than a conqueror. So I go through life. I make a difference. I am somebody like Joseph who faces the trials, who faces the struggles, and I don't give up because I care about you. I know who I am, and I know whose I am. And you tie that together, Romans 8, I'm more than a conqueror. What about me? A lot of people in this world, they turn a blind eye to God, they turn a blind eye to others, and in essence turn a blind eye to themselves. And so they do just whatever they want. And that's the world we live in by and large. It's called the broad way that leads to destruction. God says we can be different. You don't have to give up. You can be like Joseph. Young man, young woman, middle age, old, I don't care who you are, where you're from, doesn't matter what age you are. God says you don't have to give up. You can be a Joseph in this world of sin, this world of temptation. So the choice is ours. You see, Joseph faced in all of those things, he faced a choice. How am I going to react to my family mocking me? How am I going to react to my brothers selling me? How am I going to react to this transgression of this woman and her temptation that's there? He made his decision. So we go and we read about the blessedness of Joseph, the life that he continued to live long after these events, and the impact he had. But most of all, you realize where Joseph is. I want to be there. It's my choice. If we can help you to become that child of God, to look and say, yes, I want to be your child. I want to know that you're my God, you're my Father. And I want to walk in a way that will make a difference in this world, a difference in my life, and will glorify you. You do that. It's a simple matter. Galatians 3:26 and 27, you can become that child of God we spoke of by faith in Christ Jesus. As you're baptized into Christ, you have put on Christ. You're then the recipient of all the blessings that can hold that sway in your life because you know all of the things that we've studied. If we can help you to make that decision, let's do it as we stand and sing the song of invitation.